Here it is, Prague.
Okay, as you can see, I'm in Prague. But if you think I'd waste daylight hours on preparing videos for you, you're sadly mistaken. So this is something from my hotel room long after dark. Alright, we introduced in last class the shortcut method test for validity. We did at least one, but I thought I would do one more just to remind you of how to do it. So I'm going to do question 1. This is a little awkward. If I knew how to set up videos better, I wouldn't be doing this, but I'm going to do question 1 of practice quiz 13.2, page 369. There it is. Okay. Now, you can start anywhere. Basically, as you remember, the point is to try to make all the premises true and the conclusion false. And if you succeed in doing that, what you've proved is that there goes a tram. You've proved that the argument is invalid, because if it was valid, it would be impossible to make the premises true and the conclusion false, because the premises would guarantee the conclusion. So making the premises true would automatically make the conclusion false. Would make the conclusion true, because the conclusion is contained within the premises. So if we're able to do it, if we're able to make the premises true at the same time that the conclusion is false, the argument must be invalid. Now in the textbook it tells you always to start by making the conclusion false. And usually this is the best approach, just because there are more cases, specifically disjunction and conditional, where there's only one way for it to be false, but there's 3 ways for it to be true. And really, the strategy is to only fill in truth values when there's only one truth value it could be. But occasionally, it will make more sense to start by making a premise true. And we'll look at a couple like that soon. But let's start with this one. Okay, so you can look it up in your book so you know what I'm talking about, seeing as I can't do it and show you at the same time. I'm going to start by making the conclusion false. Let's see. Now the conclusion is not C, because this is question 1 of practice quiz 13.2. So that means, of course, that we make C true, because we're making not C false, as you can see. No pun intended. Alright, now the very first thing that we can do the very next thing we do is to take that truth value for C and plug it in over here, because C has to be the same truth value all the way through. Alright. Now what that means is that there's only one way for this disjunction. Actually, no, that's not true. Yes, and in fact this is a good point. Which of these premises should we do next? And the answer is this one, because actually this premise is already true. So it doesn't matter what B is. So we shouldn't fill in a truth value for B because it hasn't been decided yet. But I am going to fill in a T under the disjunction sign, because we know that this premise is already true. Alright, now we're going to try and make this premise true. So I write the T and circle it for the entire premise. And of course, being a conjunction, there's only one way for it to be true, when both A and B are true. And now that we've settled what B has to be over here, we can fill it in over here. Alright, so what have we established? I feel like Steve on Blue's Clues. What have we established? Well, yes, you're right, viewer. We've established that this argument is invalid. So we're going to write that. Invalid. And when you prove that an argument is invalid, I want you to write a little list of the letters and the corresponding truth values that make all the premises true and the conclusion false. I'll show you what I mean. So for this one, it's A is true, B is true, and in fact C is true. So we would write it out like this. Now, when you find that an argument is valid, you do something different, because if you remember, when it turns out to be valid, we arrive at a contradiction. But and when that happens, it means that what I mean by contradiction is you will fail to make one of the premises true, or you will fail to make the conclusion false. Usually one of the premises, because you usually started by making the conclusion false. But if you start with the premises and making all the premises true ends up forcing the conclusion to be true, then that's where your contradiction is. You know, you will try and make the conclusion false, but the values for the letters that are forced by the premises being true will make the conclusion true. Or the values of the letters that you get from making the conclusion false and most of the premises true will force one of the premises to be false. But anyway, why don't you try some of the exercises in Practice Quiz 13.2. What else have you got to do? Get on it. Good. Alright, have you finished that? I was just napping. I'm a bit jet-lagged. Alright, well now, if you've done a few, I'm going to do this one for you. So this is question 12. If you've already done it, well, we can compare notes. If you haven't, let's see how to do it. Now, as with all of the examples in the book, in this exercise, there's only one way for the conclusion to be false. So we can start by making the conclusion false. But of course, we can also start by making A true, because there's only one way for this premise to be true, seeing as it's a single letter, and that's if A is true. So actually we can fill in both of those. So, to make if D then E false, there's only one way that a conditional can be false, which, as we all know, is the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. So we can fill in those values. So D is true and E is false. And we can also make A true. And then we can carry over all of those values to the remaining rather complicated premise. Alright, this is dynamite video. So here we go. We've got the conclusion is false, so D is true and E is false. We've got A is true. We plug all those in, and I've stated that if D then E here is false, which is the little triangle there. So we now know that C and if D then E must be false because it's a conjunction and one of these is false. So I'm going to fill that in as well. Let's use an upside down triangle for that one. Now notice, I haven't filled in the truth value for C here because we haven't been forced to any single particular truth value. So I'm going to leave that blank and see if the remaining part of the premise will force us to put a single value there. So let's see. We're trying to make the whole thing true. But, of course, what we now see is that because this is a disjunction, A or B is already true, because A is true. So, we've got, I'm going to use a little upside down triangle there. We've got, it's already settled that this whole conditional must be false, because its antecedent is true, and its consequent is false. And that's without settling the values of D or C, because it doesn't matter what D is, A or B will always be true, and it doesn't matter what C is, C and something false will always be false. So we can just put, well, what that means is, first of all, we have shown that this argument is valid because we were unable to make this premise true. The values that made this premise true combined with the values that make this conclusion false force this premise to be false. So what we do is we write a false under the main connective, which is the conditional, circle it, and then we draw an arrow going to that false, the part where we failed to make all the premises true and the conclusion false, and we write valid. Like that, right there. So you say valid, and you draw an arrow to the part of the argument that proves this. In this case, it's this premise being false. Alright, next I'm going to try question, what is that? Oh, this is question 15 on page 288. I'm going to try that next. If you want to give it a shot first, well, now would be a good time to try it. I'll give you a few seconds. That should give you enough time. Now, the first thing you should notice about this one is that the conclusion can be false in more than one way. So if you start with the conclusion, you're going to have to draw two lines. You would have to draw a line for when G is true and H is false, but you'd also have to do another line where G is false and H is true. That's if you start with this one. So starting by making this false is going to force you to do more work. It's going to force you to do two lines. Well, we want to be creatively lazy. We want to avoid doing more than one line wherever possible. So we're not going to start by making the conclusion false. We're going to see if we can start, if there's one of the premises that can be true only one way. And of course, an obvious candidate is here. So we're going to start by making F true. Because of course, it's a single letter, so there's only one way it can be true. And then we fill in the value for F wherever it shows up elsewhere. Now, where should we go next? Well, this one, we shouldn't go here. It's hard to think backwards when I'm moving this thing. We shouldn't necessarily go here because this one can be true because it's a conditional, can be true in more than one way. So again, we'd have to add lines if we went here next. So let's see if this one, which is after all a conjunction, can only be true in one way, or whether or not we can come up with values for some of the letters at least, that there's only one thing where they can be to make it true. So, well, actually one of them we can. Because it's a conjunction, both sides of the conjunction have to be true, which means, of course, this conditional has to be true. And we know that the antecedent is already true, so there's only one thing G can be to make the whole thing true, which is true. So we can fill that in. So G is true, and once we've done that, we can fill in G elsewhere. And that, so there's G shows up 3 times, and perhaps most important is in the conclusion. But it also shows up here. So we know now that the antecedent of this first premise is true. So I'm going to fill that in. Which means, no, I shouldn't circle it, I'll put a square on it. Which means, of course, that if that premise is going to be true, H has to be true. And then I can fill in H elsewhere. What I'm talking about is here, because we made the antecedent true, so for the whole thing to be true, the conclusion can't be, the consequent can't be false. So I made it true, and I filled in true under here. Alright, which means that the consequent of this conditional, because it's not H, is going to be false, which means that we have to make I false too, because otherwise we'll have true false and this conditional will be false. So I'm going to fill that in. So we have all of this, and that will make this premise true. The trouble is, so we made both premises true. No, 3 premises true. So the first premise is true. We started by making F true, and now we've made this one true as well. But the trouble is, look at the values that we've plugged into the conclusion. When they're both the same, that means the whole thing is true. So we have once again failed to make all the premises true and the conclusion false. But in this case, where we failed is with the conclusion. That is true when it should be false, so that's where we put our arrow. And we write valid right here. So, with all the ones in practice quiz 13.2, the conclusion can be made false in only one way. So I wanted to show you, so usually it makes sense to start by making the conclusion false, but I wanted to show you one example where you would do the conclusion last. Not necessarily, because actually you could have done the conclusion before you did this one. So it's not the only way you could have done it. But if you do the conclusion last and it ends up being forced to be true, that shows that the argument is valid. Okay, I'm going to do one more example, and it's one I made up, and it's this one on the bottom. So, premise 1, if A then B, premise 2, if B then C, premise 3, C or D, and conclusion A and D. Give that a shot yourself for a second. I'll wait. Okay, what you probably noticed is that there is no premise or conclusion that can only be the value you want it to be, true for the premises, false for the conclusion, one way. And that's because I designed it that way to illustrate a point. So what this means is that you can't avoid adding lines to your shortcut method. Now, usually you only need 3 lines, which isn't too bad, but still, I wanted to show you a case where you couldn't just do it in a single line. So, it doesn't really matter where we start. If we start by making the conclusion false because it's a conjunction, there are 3 ways it could be false. If we start by making any of the premises true because they're either conditional or disjunction, they can be true 3 ways. So let's start with the conclusion. I'm going to make it false, but because there are 3 different ways it can be false, I'm going to fill in all those values. It can be A can be false, D can be true, A can be true, D can be false, or they can both be false. Those are the 3 possibilities. Okay, so I filled in the truth values here, the 3 different varieties that will make the conclusion false, and I've carried the truth values for each of A and D over here. And what we notice already is that in the rows where A is false, because A is the antecedent of conditional, the first premise is already true. And of course, also, where D is true, because that's a disjunction, that's going to make C or D true. Now, what we should see already is that because the 2 premises with the first and the last premise in the first row, here and here, are true, it's very easy to make the 3rd one true. So, on the very first row, we will have succeeded in making all the premises true and the conclusion false. What that means is actually you only needed 1 row because you struck lucky with this combination, and you did succeed in making all the premises true and the conclusion false. However, if you failed on the first row, if it looked like you couldn't, suppose on the first row you couldn't make all the premises true and the conclusion false, that would normally mean that you have a valid argument. But because there are 2 other rows to do, you can't stop there. If you do prove on the first row that the argument is invalid, then you can stop. because invalidity trumps everything. When you proved invalidity on one row, that means, bam, the argument is invalid. But if you fail to prove invalidity on just the first row, that doesn't prove that the argument is valid because you have 2 more rows to check. It so happens that in this one, we did succeed on the first row. I'll just fill that in. And actually, what that shows is that this argument is so invalid that it doesn't really matter what the truth values are for B and C. Now, the only thing that you can't have is a combination where B is true at the same time that C is false. But you can have both of them be false. You can have B be false and C be true, or you can have both of them be true. So the way we write that, because this is invalid, we write out invalid, and normally we list the truth values of each of the letters. And you can do that for A and D. You can say A is false and D is true, because those were the values that we filled in. Now, what do we do for the remaining 2? Well, ideally, we would indicate that there's more than one truth value that they can be. So perhaps I could just write it, I will write out this. Any combination except B true and C equals false. If you can see my handwriting. So that indicates that there's more than one possibility for making this invalid. And what that means is if you did the long table, which, if you remember, because there are 4 letters, there would be 16 rows on that table, it turns out that there would actually be more than one row where all the premises are true and the conclusion is false. There would be a row, on all the rows, A would be false and D would be true, but there would be a row where A is false, B is false, C is false, and D is true, and there would also be a row when A is false, B is true, C is true, and D is true, and there would be one more row as well. Okay, I think we have covered everything important about the shortcut method. But I want you to practice it, because it's been my experience that this is the thing that people screw up most on the final. There will be several questions on this on the final, but because we've done it relatively early in the stuff that's going to be on the final, people tend to forget about it. So I want to make sure that you've got it thoroughly ingrained and you don't forget about it. So practice makes perfect. And of course, because this video is so short and so entertaining, you can watch it 20 times, and that way you'll never forget it. Alright, see you in the next video.